2020, the global fishing industry reached an all-time record, with seafood worth an estimated $406 billion.
The only food industry that relies completely on the cycles of nature.
Fish is a key resource, an important source of protein, essential in feeding the growing world population.
Seafood is really diverse.
Our seafood comes from the boat, gets cut, gets packed. It's cold, it's wet, it's icy, and these guys are there day in and day out.
Illegal operations,
trafficked and forced labor,
and overfishing threaten global food security,
and have trapped cod to near oblivion,
the health of the planet, and the livelihoods of millions of fishermen.
If sustainable fishing practices were in place everywhere, this could lead to over $50 billion in profits globally.
The big challenge is bringing good management to the parts of the world that don't have it.
Here's what's shaping the seafood economy. In the U.S., 8.4 billion pounds of seafood were produced across all 50 states in 2020, worth a collective $4.8 billion.
We have the most nutrient-rich, amazing fishing grounds right here off the coast of New England.
The commercial fishing industry is thriving in the U.S., especially in New Bedford, Massachusetts.
Foley Fish was founded in 1906 by my great-grandfather. Come on. I started working summer after my freshman year in high school.
New Bedford is the most valuable fishing port in the U.S., bringing in over $376 million worth of seafood in 2020. And over 80% of that value came from sea scallops.
The importance of having a fishmonger or fishmongeress at the source is that we get first crack at the fish.
Bright red, this fish was breathing recently, so that's a good sign.
When the boats are landing, we get the call and our guys can go over and look at the fish as it's coming down the chute and say yes or no. Do I want to buy it or don't I want to buy it?
Here at the auction this morning, there's about 125,000 pounds of scallops. The auction is now held online. Doing some rough calculations, if there's 125,000 pounds of scallops going for, say, $20 a pound, not even including the extra costs like the auction's cut or transportation, that's a room worth $2.5 million in sea scallops.
In many ways, we are running a business very similarly to when my great-grandfather did. So if the boats are out, 7 to 9 to 10 to 12 days, we have to go and say, listen, we only want the fish that was harvested 24 to 48 hours ago. So we want to start with a fresher product. Then we want to get it into the plant, cut it, pack it, ship it in the most efficient way possible.
Overfishing in the 1980s, bigger nets, better technology to find the fish, reduced their numbers. Trouble is, how do you limit a catch?
The fishing stocks did have a collapse in the early 90s. It changed the species that we were offering, it changed the availability, it changed the pricing.
The fish stocks collapse of the 90s led to changes of the Magnuson-stevens Act of 1976, which is the primary law governing marine systems.
And until recently, there were practically no regulations governing the size of the catch.
The amendments ultimately made the U.S. into a world leader of fisheries management, outlawing overfishing and demanding population rebuilding. Overfishing is when the fish harvest outweighs the maximum sustainable yield.
So you're fishing harder than would maximize yield. But it doesn't mean declining. It doesn't mean going extinct. It doesn't mean collapsing. It simply means fishing too hard.
Think of it like a bank account. There's the capital and there's the interest. Overfishing is when fishers are collecting more than just that interest. They're dipping into the capital.
You have 100 fish and they reproduce by 10 a year. You extract 12 the next year, then you're overfishing by 2. Fisheries management actually works. If it's not implemented properly, then the resources deteriorate, the capital in your bank account starts going down because you're extracting more than your interest, and then you get into trouble.
In fact, most scientists equate overfishing with being unsustainable. And if your objective is to continue producing food, you can be overfishing and be sustained forever. It's just you're not maximizing how much you could catch. So I'd say that's fundamental misunderstanding.
Then there's overfished.
Stocks are overfished if they're at low abundance.
Think of the bank account again. It's sort of like a risky investment that you bet the capital on, and you get some losses, maybe because of overfishing or because of global warming.
So the idea that fish are disappearing from the ocean, no, that's not true. Fish stocks naturally fluctuate.
In the US, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that 90% of fisheries are now sustainably managed. As of June 2020, 47 fish stocks have been rebuilt, like the Chinook salmon, and, as we saw in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Atlantic sea scallops.
So we've gone from hard sort of days at sea limitations to now annual catch limits. It's an imperfect science.
There are some species in the US that could be fished harder than they are, but we need all of the resources in place to be able to do that.
Underfishing has become common in the US. This is when fish are harvested at a rate lower than would produce maximum sustainable yield.
There are some issues that have led to underfishing of annual catch limits in New England on certain species as a result of trying to protect other species. So it's complex. It's definitely complex.
Hilborn said as much as 20% to 30% of potential yield is lost by cautious management. For example, when NOAA reported catch numbers for greater Atlantic groundfish, that's cod, haddock, flounder sorts of fish, only about 15% of potential catch, measured in pounds, was harvested between May 2021 and April 2022.
It is always going to be complex because it is a multi-species fishery in New England, and so when you bring your net up, even if you're trying to target something, you may end up with something else. If it's a species with a lower quota, you have to be super careful or you're going to not be able to fish for the rest of the year.
Some fish might not be fished to the fullest because no one wants to buy that fish.
And we do side-by-side tasting comparisons to say,
have Atlantic pollock.
Look, this is what cod tastes like, but this is what hake tastes like, and we do it blindly. So when we say, can anyone tell us what the difference is between cod, haddock, Atlantic pollock, and hake? And oftentimes they can't. Could use them alternately labeled correctly. And by the way, because they're not as well known and in demand by every restaurant across America, they're going to be more affordable.
Seattle Fish is one of the companies that has partnered with the World Wildlife Fund's Sustainable Fisheries projects, helping get ethical product for retailers and restaurants.
WWF has a big footprint inside our industry. They've partnered with some of our larger customers, including Kroger. We end up investing in that fishery improvement project from the source. It's managed by WWF, and then WWF then provides advisement, support services, and leadership for Kroger around their sustainability program.
We really believe that the private sector is at the forefront of solutions for reducing impact on ocean ecosystems. We work with corporate partners of ours to help them make good decisions about where they're buying their fish from, and also help support those systems that are producing the products that they sell.
So we have whole black sea bass, whole red snapper, porgies, and Spanish mackerel all caught in the United States.
Carrie Brownstein is head of global seafood standards for Whole Foods Market. She says the key is knowing their suppliers.
We have a tremendous emphasis on traceability in our seafood sourcing, and we don't buy seafood from fisheries that are poorly managed or not even managed at all.
Market really responds to consumer requests around more sustainable sourcing.
Fish are pretty sensitive to where they're going to spawn, what areas, what their temperature is, and ocean acidification definitely is an issue. Obviously, shellfish, we have to be super mindful about pollution and clean water.
Global warming is also a variable when it comes to what fish stocks are defined as overfished.
Stocks are called overfished if they're at low abundance, but stocks are often at low abundance, not because they're fished too hard, but because the environment has changed.
90% of the extra heat that we produce as a result is actually accumulating in the ocean, purely by a temperature regulation.
So for instance, the lobster population in the state of New York has basically disappeared because it's just too warm down there now. The population in New York would now be called overfished because it's at very low abundance, even though really didn't have anything to do with being fished. The current thinking is that the cod populations of U.S. waters are never going to come back to where they were, even if we didn't fish them, because it's too warm to support the giant populations that used to be there.
Many of the processes in the ocean rely on the heat of the sun and the nutrients coming from the bottom of the ocean to the surface. You might reach the nutrients when the population is not ready to reproduce.
With the increasing impacts of climate change, we're needing to build into good fishery management practices in order to be able to respond appropriately.
America imports anywhere from 70% to 85% of its seafood. And in 2020, the US imported over 6 billion pounds of seafood worth over $21 billion, while seafood exports equaled just 2.4 billion pounds, valued at $4.4 billion. That makes the national seafood trade deficit $17 billion.
What's harder is making sure it's not the product of a crime, whether it's caught using slave labor, stolen from protected waters, or captured in ways that threaten fish populations.
The Magnuson-stevens Act was amended again in 2007, this time directing the U.S. to address illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing and bycatch, the aquatic life scooped up by accident.
I saw 120 sharks dead on the deck of the Steve Urban. We found short-fin mako sharks, we found blue sharks, brown seals, common dolphins, swordfish, mola mola or sunfish. We found squid, albacore tuna.
Many countries don't have data on trends and fish stocks because they don't have management systems in place.
And everything we do know suggests that on average, they are fishing too hard. Those countries dominated by South and Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand.
Since the late 90s, the U.S. seafood market started to rely more heavily on imports, with those imports approximately doubling from 1.5 million tons to 3 million tons from 1998 to 2018. That's because people want to eat fish, and other countries pivoted to fish farming, all while the U.S. battled the collapse of fish stocks.
Illegal fishing happens across the globe, but it's been especially rampant here in Thailand. It can mean stealing from other countries' waters, using banned equipment, or labor abuse, everything from slavery to murder.
It's hard to find every instance of crime in the supply chain. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission, $2.4 billion worth of seafood from illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing were imported in 2019. That was about 11% of total U.S. seafood imports. Not only would eliminating imports of illegal, unregulated, and unreported seafood result in more expensive import costs, and thus less imports overall, it would increase U.S. prices, catches of fish, and increase the total operating income of the U.S. commercial fishing industry by an estimated $60.8 million.
Fisheries management, I actually see one of the big problems is this perception that it isn't working.
Sustainable management can rebuild overfished stocks and increase production by 16.5 million tons. That would contribute to food security, nutrition, and the economies of coastal communities across the globe.
The essential elements is you have to have a science program that is tracking the abundance and status of the fish stocks. You have to have a regulatory framework that adjusts the fishing pressure, either by restricting time, number of boats, or the actual total catch. And you have to have a system that enforces it.
With the fishery management, we're getting every year a better and better idea of what is and is not in the ocean and where it is and is not.
The fishing industry is growing, mostly thanks to aquaculture, aka fish farming, and the reason the US started relying on a lot more imports. Globally, aquaculture production reached a record in 2020, 87.5 million tons of aquatic animals worth nearly $265 billion.
We are moving to a world of 10 billion people. They all have a right to eat.
By 2030, the UN estimates that aquatic food production will increase 15% due to intensified and expanded sustainable aquaculture production.
If we cannot manage fisheries properly, and we have to rely on land-based food production systems, the environmental impact to the planet will be many times bigger.
and the potential for aquaculture in the US is relatively untapped.
My motto is that I work to make hope possible rather than despair convincing.